Welcome to Keith and I Don't Tread on Anyone. Today I am joined by Mike Termott. You can check him out at miketermott.com. Links will be in the description below. He is running for the LP nominee for president in 2024. Is that correct?
It is correct, Keith.
We're,
Thanks for letting me join you tonight. It's nice to be together.
of course. And where is the best place to find your information, where you stand on the issues, and where people can learn more about you?
Two important places. They can go to miketermott.com. The only challenge there is spelling the last name correctly, right? I wish it were just mike.com, but that seems to have been taken. Termott has two A's, so if you can do miketermaat.com, you'll find your way there. That's the basic website for the campaign. But folks can also go to goldnewdeal.org. Don't go to goldnewdeal.com. They'll try to sell you something, which is, by the way, not necessarily a bad idea. It's just the wrong website. But if you go to goldnewdeal.org, you'll see our platform. Our platform we call the Gold New Deal as a separately branded and separately URL'd platform.
What is libertarianism?
Libertarianism is the philosophy that the most important thing a government can do, indeed, maybe the only legitimate thing that a government can do, is stand up for your individual rights and your individual liberties. And beyond that, I think anyone who espouses libertarianism is skeptical about a government being involved in your life and in any which way. At least that's the angle from a public policy point of view. There are those who would argue that libertarianism is a philosophy that ought to inform us and in terms of how we deal with each other in the private sector as well. But for present purposes, I am mostly focused on public policy, as you might imagine.
When it comes to the Federal Reserve, what is it? Why is it important?
Well, I don't know that everyone needs a 3-hour discourse on exactly what is the Federal Reserve System. It's an ostensibly private sector organization that's chartered by the federal government, run by appointees of the President of the United States. It is somewhat controlled underneath that by its member banking institutions. But the most important thing about it for present purposes is that it plays not only a regulatory function in the financial services industries, but it controls our monetary policy, the control of the money stock worldwide of the American dollar. And for this reason, a lot of hopes and dreams have been foisted upon the Federal Reserve System that has proven over the last 100 years, notwithstanding great efforts and notwithstanding great people who have been involved with the Fed, it is just unable to live up to the mandate that we have put on it to lean against the boom bust cycle and to try to smooth out how our economy operates. It just simply can't get the job done. I think personally, it is time to stop expecting the Fed to do something that it can't do and to replace its monetary policy discretion with a rules-based system. I think that that's very important. It's one of the things that I'm running on most vociferously.
Now, one of the amazing things that you'll hear the average voter say is that monopolies are absolutely dangerous. However, the state should monopolize the money supply and compulsory education and the legislative branch of how people operate in the commercial sector. How is it that voters can believe two things simultaneously which explicitly contradict each other?
I think it's because people naturally have what you and I would disagree with, right? But I think that a lot of folks naturally have, and maybe naturally isn't quite the right word, maybe they've been conditioned to have a certain amount of faith in public sector institutions and organizations and governments that I feel is completely inappropriate. And to be fair, I think that a lot of folks have been kept in the dark. I would say even you and I have been kept in the dark to a certain extent over the years about how it is that various government institutions operate. I think that our eyes are much more wide open than they used to be. And so in this sense, if you were not someone who was dedicating a lot of time to paying attention to your government, and by the way, you ought to be able to live your life without feeling like you need to dedicate hours in each day to, keeping a track on your government. It's a shame that you do. But if you were not paying a lot of attention, you could get, let me say, suckered into believing the politicians who take it upon themselves to lie to you, to operate in the shadows, to run the government in a way that is frequently, sometimes largely, not in your interest, but in their own interest, for their own power, for their self-aggrandizement. So I understand why some people have a faith in these institutions and are willing to tolerate what they would not tolerate from the private sector.
There was a study in from Gallup that says 55% of Americans say race relations are either very bad or somewhat bad. What can libertarianism or a libertarian presidency give us that would take a number of steps towards resolving such a divide?
Well, I think one of the most important things we can do is shift the conversation to one of a delimited powers style of government that doesn't try to intrude in your life and impose on you a particular way of thinking. In this regard, I think the Democratic Party, with all due respect to the Democrats in your audience, of which there may be many, the Democratic Party is no longer what we would traditionally label socially liberal. It's not an organization that lets you think whatever you want to think, feel however you want to feel. They quite literally expect you to toe the party line. Democratic with a capital D led institutions expect you to fall into a certain philosophy. And if you don't, you will be so-called canceled, right? Or run out on a rail, metaphorically speaking, hopefully. And for this reason, we have had a number of public conversations that I think have gone in some very weird directions. I think that we have fallen into a trap whereby which we sort of aggrandize the status of folks that we deem to be victims. And therefore we tease out, we highlight, in some cases we exaggerate the effects of bad things going on in our culture. And that's not to say that there isn't racism in the United States. There absolutely is. Take it from me. I've seen it firsthand. I'm sure you have, and your viewers have too. As someone of a certain age, I can tell you that the American culture is going the right direction. Things are better than they used to be. That's not to say that they're perfect. I don't even know how to characterize what is great, what is wonderful versus, what stinks. But I can tell you we're going in a better direction than we used to be. And so for this reason, I find it disturbing that so many more folks today would say that we have deep race relations problems compared to what I believe the data would show from polls, say, 15, 20, 25 years ago.
Check out MikeTermott.com. As you can see on your screen, right on the upper right-hand corner, you can see all the issues, and the Fed, COVID, China, police, and poverty. Excellent site to check
At least
out.
some of the issues, maybe not all of them, to the extent to which somebody visits and you don't get an answer that you want, or if you do get an answer to the issue that you care about and you don't like the answer, reach out to me because my contact information is listed there. And by the way, that's my real email address listed there and my real phone number. If you call me, I might not answer because I might not know who the heck you are. But if you drop me a text first, I'd be happy to chat with you.
True or false? Socialism is about helping people.
It is false, fundamentally. There are those who do want to help people who are socialists. So I don't want to suggest that socialism per se means the opposite. But socialism is a philosophy that says that the public sector should be in charge of the economy. That doesn't necessarily automatically mean it's good or bad. As it turns out, socialism doesn't work as a practical matter, as an empirical matter. And for this reason, I think it's important for those of us who originally came to libertarianism from what I would call the right-hand side. I grew up as a Republican, as a banker, as a fiscal conservative. before figuring out the Republican Party was not what it had been cracked up to be. For those of us who grew up on that side of the ledger, it's important for us to be very loud about the fact that socialism just doesn't work, subjectively, objectively speaking. And for those of us who have come to recognize, as I have, that coming to libertarianism from the left-hand side, if I can characterize it as such, which is to say, as an ethical proposition, we all have an internal and eternal right to make decisions for ourselves. That even if it were true, and it's not, but imagine even if it were true that socialism worked, it still would not be the case that the government, any public sector organization has a moral authority to make decisions for you. We all have a right to make decisions for ourselves.
Let's say that I believe I'm a socialist because I want the public at large to be making decisions, not just some people. If I want people to be generally represented throughout institutions in society, should I want the state to control things or the private sector?
I would think that you would want the private sector to control things if you were interested in garnering as much diversified, if I heard your question correctly, diversified representation as possible. One of the problems with public sector decision making is that it naturally leads to a power play. The people who are in charge need to double down in terms of control, in terms of gaining power and authority, because their shtick is, right, the way socialism works is inherently a matter of control. And in this sense, if you really care about representation, if you really care about the most thorough style of representation possible, you really need to avoid a situation where a relatively small number of people control things from the top. It's the kiss of death in terms of either diversified representation or even a fully fledged, deep sense of representation in a republic.
That's a good answer. It had just never made sense to me where people said, I'm really represented in an organization that doesn't let me opt out of funding it. But these people that I voluntarily associate with, well, they are oppressing me, and we proletariats need to get together and start looting these stores immediately. I always thought that was backwards. Thank you for clearing it up.
Well, I think it's backwards too. Remember that Marxism was at its core, at least to the extent to which Karl believed in his own philosophy, it was at its core not even so much a philosophy, but a prediction. And so in that sense, I think that we can say, it was a good theory. It's probably worth making the theory. It's probably worth the hypothesis, right? It just turned out to be not the case, and for a variety of reasons.
We got to find a way to stop falsifying these things at such a high cost. We need more Austrian economics, no 100 million people experiments.
And we will. We are going the right direction. We've been at this for a relatively brief period of time. If you consider the American government, for all of its problems, has been doing some things right relative to the way things were before that. And that's only been 250 years. And of course, the advent of what we call Austrian economics, but free markets in general being respected as the way to go in terms of lifting people out of poverty and raising the standard of living and allowing cultures to develop appropriately is an even more recent concept. That we're talking about 100 years, no more. And in many cases, a lot less. So I would be optimistic that the philosophy will continue to spread. And by the way, Keith, I wouldn't even call it a philosophy. To me, I think this is a social science that bears out. It's going to take a long time to convince everybody, but it is well to remember that the data bear out the fact that free markets work and socialism doesn't, just as an empirical matter.
Before getting to the empiricism, what is the principal difference between the free market and the state, or whatever the alternative to a free market would be?
Well, the state control means that somebody is making a decision, whereas when markets allocate resources and set prices, it is a completely distributed sense of decision making. Markets, which is to say how people come together, there isn't necessarily a marketplace in any physical sense, although in some cases there are. But a market is the process by which people make decisions by trade, allowing prices to fluctuate in order to incentivize trade. And we have learned that in this way, resources are allocated more efficiently than when human beings try to predict where resources should be allocated and try to impose on the system what they believe that prices should be. Well intentions aside, and all the smarts in the world aside, very many very smart people have tried to make some sense of socialism work, even if you don't call it socialism. For example, the World Bank used to spend all kinds of resources trying to figure out what's the best way to allocate resources. Where should we put our loans, for example, in third world countries in order to really drive economic development? You know, where is the industry that we should invest in? What is the particular process? What is the thing that's wrong with the economy that we need to invest in and drive and push and change and incentivize in order to get things rolling? Thankfully, the World Bank has moved on from that attitude, but not completely. And no one ever called the organization socialistic, except for some of us who recognize that at its core, that's how it would work.
What are some of the most important things you learned while studying, researching, and engaging in Austrian economics?
I learned a skepticism that I think came from the Austrians that is lost a little bit with the philosophical descendants. In other words, I went to school at George Washington University, which is a rational expectation school, which is sort of a philosophical descendant of the Chicago School, which is a philosophical descendant of the Austrian school. So in this sense, they all have a tremendous amount in common. And there are those who would argue that the Chicago School is in some sense a modern, updated version of Austrian economics and rational expectations as well. And to a certain extent that's all true. But when you read the Austrians themselves, one of the things that really comes through that doesn't in the modern economic writers, at least not as much, is a skepticism not only of government, but of our ability to model how the economy works. The Austrians were very skeptical that we would be able to model how the economy works on a macroeconomic level. Notwithstanding that skepticism, economists tried over and over again for decades, ever since the 20s and 30s and 40s, and found it relatively difficult and unsuccessful. And what you find is only in the last generation have economists that have not traditionally identified themselves as Austrian come around to the notion that you need to model the economy from the microeconomic level up. To try to do so at the macroeconomic level is very challenging and arguably impossible. Pardon me.
So conservatives generally will look at new issues or world events and see that there is a divide, and the divide usually falls under, for conservatives, the civilized side versus the barbaric side. This is more or less the lens that they see through things through. How do you advocate libertarianism to someone who sees the world through a civilization versus barbarism lens?
That is a tough one, and you're right. There are plenty of conservatives who do see the world that way. By the way, I would argue that there are plenty of conservatives who see it a little bit differently than that as well. But for those who do, and you're absolutely right, because there are a number of people who do, I think I would point out that the culture war is the flip side of the economic war. And that you need to allow people to make cultural decisions the same way that you need to allow people to make economic decisions. And that you may view the world as barbaric, at least you may view the people who disagree with you, right, as being barbaric. But if you believe in freedom, if you believe in distributed decision making, if you believe in libertarianism, and a lot of conservatives don't. But if you believe in free markets and its analog, the free markets of ideas, you have to believe, I think, you have to believe that in the long run, allowing people to make decisions for themselves will come around to stronger cultures, better communities, stronger families, whether you want to argue that those are faith-based or not, but better decision making for our communities, our families, and even at the most granular level for the individual. And if you believe that some of these decisions are barbaric by your own personal standards, then you've got to trust that those ideas will be winnowed out over time. Whereas if you try to impose your view on people that, their thoughts are barbaric, right? You will get a backlash, and you will not get the results that you expect, you want, you anticipate.
Yeah, and even in these, but fancy, very civilized organizations like the Federal Reserve, well, they're depleting the savings of so many people, making it harder for families to live on a single income. Zoning laws make it impossible for people to buy houses at a young age and start families. Excellent answer to that one. It's one I always come across. Left
Yeah.
usually sees things through oppressed versus oppressor. How do you communicate libertarianism to them?
To people who see the world as oppressed versus oppressor, I think that you've got to recognize that libertarianism means standing up for individual rights, right? And allowing a government to do so to the extent to which you're right, Mr. I believe in the world is driven through oppression. To the extent to which you're right, legitimately, you and I are on the same page. If there really are people who are being oppressed, I'm standing with you for those people. However, I do not believe that we should be in the business of culturally manufacturing what you perceive to be oppression. Oppression is something that we all hate. You and I, Keith, might recognize that a lot of the oppression that we suffer today in the modern world, in the modern America, is driven by the government itself. A lot of other people would disagree with that. We need to bring them along in that sense. But to the extent to which you believe that some of your fellow citizens are truly being oppressed, I will stand with you. But this idea that oppression is the equivalent of a class society, is the equivalent of someone who doesn't make the wages that they wish that they would make, is the equivalent of I couldn't get into the school I thought I should have gotten into, or I didn't have the wealth that someone else has. This is not oppression. And I resent this recent argument in our culture that inevitably boils down to some sort of semantic argument where someone says, I'm not really free, right? I don't have freedom because in an economic sense, I live very poorly. I've got a problem with that. I've got a problem with you redefining freedom and oppression as there are poor people and therefore there's oppression. Look, one of the things that bothers me most is the fact that there is in the United States tremendous intergenerational persistent poverty. But we need to recognize that that is not something that would be automatically predicted by merely free markets. Much of the reason that we have intergenerational poverty in the United States, what a lot of socialists, for example, and Marxists and Democrats and even some Republicans call oppression, is the result of bad public policy. When you look at how bad our schools are, when you look at the black markets that are created by the prohibition on drugs and the world's most oppressive criminal justice system, when you look at our bad zoning, our bad housing policies, when you layer these things on top of each other, you see the effects on fellow Americans who can least resist the effects of bad government public policy. I often used to say when I was a cop, if you were not an economist before you became a cop, becoming a cop will turn you into one, because you see the effects of bad public policy up close and personal. It drives you crazy. You see bad public policy undermining communities and families and individuals, and it's a real heartbreaker. This is in some sense oppression, but it is not oppression just because people don't have money. It's oppression because they live in communities with crappy public policy.
So if you're on the presidential debate stage, say you're next to RFK and Ron DeSantis, uh, and you're talking to the audience, how do you take them? Let's say you know that they believe in freedom of religion. People should be free to pursue their own religion, but they don't, for some reason, believe in freedom of economics. For the very same people who they say you should be free to worship, however, even if it means you burning in hell, but you're not allowed to opt out of chipping into the school through property taxes or we'll confiscate your house. For some reason, they believe that. What do you say to people? You have 2 minutes to make the case to economic freedom, for economic freedom, the people who already believe in religious freedom, so they're already somewhat sympathetic to us. What do you say to them?
I would say to them that you would not stand for a government that steals from people the basic dignity of being able to pursue their own faith. Similarly, you should not steal from people the basic dignity of having an input into how their children are raised, how their children are educated, having the freedom to set the course for their children's education. I would similarly say, by the way, that we should not be defrauding people out of the simple dignity of being represented by a foreign policy that reflects your basic values. These are profound elements of personal human dignity that we undermine every day by taking people's resources and dedicating it to public policies in your name that you don't agree with. To me, that is so fundamental that it is similar to undermining someone's faith, someone's most profound worldview. In fact, one might argue that how you raise a children is the most important aspect of your faith, is the most important manifestation of your worldview. If you don't allow someone to educate their children the way that they see fit, what good does it do them for you to give them freedom of religion?
Very good answer. You mentioned becoming a police officer made you an economist. You became extremely skeptical of social programs that are sold to us under the guise of helping people. What else did you learn as a police officer that you would like the public to know about?
Oh my goodness, how many hours you got? Um, you learn you learn some weird stuff. You learn a few things about public policy if you weren't already a skeptical economist like I was, right? So we talk about that all the time. But the other things, Keith, that you learn by being a cop is that our criminal justice system is so oppressive. You learn that the way that police officers are managed prevents your police department from being better aligned with the community's values. You'll learn that cops, although typically, at least the ones that I worked with, typically were registered Republicans, most have a libertarian streak.
Mm-hmm.
Most are skeptical of government. Most are skeptical of things like the war on drugs, right? They're skeptical of the effectiveness of the war on poverty. They do believe in free markets. And for this reason, I do believe that there is inherently a market for our thoughts, our ideas as libertarians among police officers. I think that over time, and I do believe we're going in the right direction, but it takes a long time. I do believe that there is a natural bond between libertarian philosophy and police officers in regard to imposing market forces on how police officers are managed. I think that most cops recognize that someday police officers and communities will both be better off when, for example, the best police officers get paid more, the weak police officers get paid less, and the crappy ones get fired. Just as one example. We want it to look more like other businesses and other industries. And you learn as a cop that the unions prevent this, and that's not in the interest of the community. As an economist, I also recognize it wasn't even in the interest of police officers. So there's a lot of ground to make. By the way, same thing with teachers.
So let me give you a statistic that you could hear in the culture war, and then we'll try and apply it. I want to see how we could hopefully have a president who isn't actively dividing people of goodwill. Men are 50% of the population, yet 95% of those killed by police. Therefore, there is sexism against men within the police department. How do you analyze such a reality?
I think
That's
the
according to
reality
the
is,
Washington Post, by the way.
according to the Washington Post. Well, it is also true that men commit most of the crime, that men particularly commit most of the violent crime, that men are typically more involved with guns. You layer these three things on top of each other, you're going to get a lot more instances when the potential for violence is manifested, including shooting by police officers. The vast majority of shootings by police officers, of course, are examples where the community would say that's how we wanted it to work out, right? But there are plenty of examples, and I would not argue otherwise. And if I say anything counter, correct me. But we should not be arguing that there are not plenty of instances where police officers make mistakes, because there are. Indeed, there are enough that I think it reflects a real need to change the way that we hold police officers accountable, how we manage police officers, and by the way, how we train and recruit and compensate police officers. It's a mix, because we need to shift, in my view, police culture.
What about just having some sort of market mechanism for the police that if people really are unhappy with the service that the police are providing, crime is too high, they're not arresting enough really bad guys, and they're enforcing too many occupational licensing imprisonments. Would you be for, maybe having the same principle that people have for me that we have for the police? If they're not happy with the job, they have the right to opt out of funding police departments?
I would argue that the way to do that is make it easier to replace your police department with someone else who could bid on that contract for service.
Very nice.
And in other words, the city, as an example, the city that I used to work for, we had a medium-sized police department, 100 officers. The city only had really two choices. One was our police department, or they could fire us all, dump the police department, and hire the sheriff's office. And once in a while, they would remind us that, we've got another choice if you people don't behave, right? And that's a good thing. But two is not a large number of choices. And one of the reasons why we don't have more choices is because state law did not support private sector organizations from competing for a contract to provide that service. And I believe that things would be better with greater competition in order to do that. Now, I'm not suggesting that means, willy-nilly Bob's Chop Shop should be hiring officers and, go in there untrained and just hire whoever they want. A city, any jurisdiction, any public sector organization is going to hire a police department needs to be more involved with training, understanding who's being hired, who's being promoted, how people are held accountable. So it's not merely a matter of creating more competition at an agency level. We also need to create more competition at the officer level. We want organizations to be competing for the best officers. We want officers to be rated. We want more transparency in the context of discipline, in the context of training, performance. We want this information available to decision makers so they can compete for the best officers and get rid of the crappy ones, just like any other industry. You said like you, I think you do a pretty good job, but you're right. If your constituents thought you were stinking up the court, everyone needs the right to say, no, I'm not going to watch that podcast anymore. I'm going somewhere else.
So I'm trying to think of, it sounds like, we're just talking about, theoretically, there could be examples of, privatization and security, but I see these private examples all around us. My PayPal account is private security, along with my Venmo. All of my
Right.
computer is done privately. When I go to the Arizona Diamondbacks game, private security. Scottsdale Mall, private security. When
Yep.
I'm at the Slipknot concert with the most violent drug addicts probably anywhere in Arizona, private security was keeping us all safe, even though they let that fire go on a little too long.
I
Other than that,
understand.
even in these instances, we still see private, this far from being some pie in the sky dream that in 1,000 years, when Ayn Rand is resurrected, we could have it again. This is all around us. So I'm so
Yeah.
happy that you're promoting this.
Well, I think there is some there. I think that there is some potential, and I think you're right. People are getting increasingly comfortable with private sector security and increasingly frustrated with public sector security. And anytime, I want to draw a distinction. Anytime when you have a community come together to make a joint decision, that is inherently a public sector decision. And policing is inherently a geographic function. So it's going to be very difficult to get out of the notion that there's going to have to be some public sector decision making. But that public sector decision making can be, how do we hire the right contractor to provide us service? Similarly, you pointed out as an example, private sector security, but consider we also have examples where counties and cities and other public sector entities hire, for example, garbage services, right? That are not always public sector employees, that frequently hire a contractor to provide that service. So in that sense, we also have a model that makes sense.
Would you, as president, support decriminalizing all capitalist acts between consenting adults?
Yes, the way you say it leads me to believe that you might have something weird up your sleeve, but
Jimmy Dore
that should
accused me
always
of this.
be the default, right? That should always be the default. And I wouldn't even use the word capitalist. I would just say, free. Consenting adults should be allowed to do whatever it is that they want, as long as they're not hurting someone else or taking someone else's stuff. It's not like I just made that up and that was something profound that no one had ever said before. But that should be the default. I do believe, I don't know which pile you want to go after first, but there are any number of examples that I think we can really make some great progress over the next decade. It might have to be stepwise, but we can make a lot of progress. For example, getting rid of the black markets and the war on drugs, getting rid of the black markets due to immigration policy, getting rid of black markets in prostitution, for example. These are areas where a lot of ground can be made up. The president doesn't have a lot of control over some of those, obviously, but can shift the conversation, which I think is your point. A president can shift the conversation to one of, look, criminalizing things should be a matter of where there's a real victim, not just behavior that conservatives don't like.
Yeah, maybe I need to reword that because there's actually no follow-up directly onto that. Just a idea that I got from Robert Nozick, the Harvard philosopher, just trying to get a principled idea of where you stand in hopes of giving us an idea of of how you would look at other issues. One more thing on the cultural front. April 2014, CNBC. When women succeed, America succeeds, President Barack Obama said Tuesday in remarks Equal Pay Day and urged Congress to pass more legislation to close the gender pay gap, responding to critics who say the gender gap in pay has been overstated. Obama said bluntly, it's not myth, it's math. Gender pay gap. What does a term presidency look like?
There is so much to unpack and yet so little at the same time. It's a frustrating matter. Barack Obama, I believe, just as an aside, okay, he seems like a nice fella. He really does. He's well educated. He's obviously a smart guy.
I'll give you that.
But he says some really stupid things. You know, all right, I just had to get that off my chest. Let's move beyond that. We all want individuals to get paid what it is that they earn. Data show in the United States that it has been largely achieved in terms of male versus female. Indeed, the most sophisticated research suggests that the difference between male and female compensation on an hourly basis for the same work is so small that it is not possible to determine whether there is a difference there or not. Having said that, even if you believe that there were a gap on an hourly pay basis, having the government involved is not going to solve your problem. It's sort of like trying to convince yourself that affirmative action is going to eradicate racism. I appreciate where your heart is, but it's dumb public policy. In the case of the hourly wages, you can't even argue that there's a systemic problem, much less that government intervention would be a reasonable solution. So in this sense, I think that we just have to move on. I think that the real interesting aspect of this debate in public is the extent to which we continue to believe something that just isn't true. I think that there's a real study there. There's a real social science study to be had there. And I look forward to someone explaining why this belief persists that hasn't been true for at least a dozen years.
So Thomas Sowell said since 1969, Japanese Americans have out-earned white Americans by 30%. Looking at that wage gap, why is it that we see gaps in wages between groups?
Well, there's different reasons for different considerations, right? It depends on how you define a group. In this particular instance, and by the way, Sowell has analyzed racially defined groups, not just in the United States, but all over. And he has pointed out quite correctly that the United States is probably not a racist place to live, certainly by international standards, but you do see disparities in group earnings when you define groups by race all over the world. The most logical, the most likely, and I'm not going to hold myself out as some expert on the various cultures of individual groups within the United States population, but Sowell will point out that the most logical reason why there are disparities is because there are disparities in culture. There are cultures that do a better job than others of supporting the various aspects of lifestyle that are necessary to achieve greater earnings and wealth. And that, by the way, is not to say that it's necessarily true that achieving greater earnings and wealth is the be all and end all and, is what you should organize your culture around to achieve. No one should be making that argument either. But there are differences across cultures, and sometimes those align with race. And by the way, it is also true, you haven't asked me this, but it is also true that the United States has had a tremendous legacy of cultural problems that originated with our original constitutional sin of slavery. That when you layer on all of the bad public policy beginning in the 60s, well-intentioned, but erroneously targeted bad public policy beginning in the 1960s, on top of what were obviously huge gaps in terms of wealth between white families and black families, you can see where some of these disparities have persisted for reasons that include the bad public policy itself. And this is a real shame.
Do you have time for 3 more questions, maybe 6 or 7 minutes?
Go for it.
Senator Chris Murphy was on C-SPAN February 25th, 2014. Referring to his time in Ukraine, he said, "I think it was our role, including sanctions and threats of sanctions, that forced, in part, Yanukovych from office." Lindsey Graham, 2017, in Ukraine, said to the Banderite fighters, "Your fight is our fight. 2017 will be the year of offense. All of us will go back to Washington, and we will push the case against Russia. Enough of Russian aggression. It is time for them to pay a heavier price." Adam Schiff, 2020, said, "The United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there, and we don't have to fight Russia here." Why should people, if they want to oppose a third world war with Russia over Ukraine or with China over Taiwan, why should they embrace libertarianism?
They should embrace libertarianism because libertarians recognize there's a philosophical answer, Keith, and there is a practical answer. The philosophical answer is that libertarians are the ones that are going to stand up for your right to live your life without having the backlash of trying to impose your values or the United States militaristic interventionist foreign policy on someone else. And by the way, that matters, not only as a philosophical matter, but let's talk about the practical implications. The United States foreign policy that does not align with your values also, in my view, does not align with your economic interests. It does not align with your foreign policy interests. If you believe that your family and you would be better off with a booming economy, you cannot support the idea of, put 60 seconds on the clock. How many dumb things does the federal government of the United States do? Sending hundreds now of billions of dollars to Ukraine in order to fight a proxy war against Russia. And those quotes just pointed out that we have been, I shouldn't say we, that certain senators and others in the federal government have been itching for a fight with Russia for decades because it is part of their philosophical fabric that Russia represents a threat to us and that we need to take them down a peg. If we have learned anything from the fight in Ukraine, it is that the extent to which we have been fearing the Russian army reflects a little bit more paranoia than good analysis. It is also true that projecting American power around the world for no other obvious strategic value than to preserve our own military hegemony. This is not in the interest of individual Americans. We should be fostering an environment around the world of peace in order to promote trade, in order to promote the development of our economy, but also, by the way, to develop our own culture and culture around the world. The interaction of human beings in an environment of peace is where the healthy development of culture and individual humans comes from. For all these reasons, we have really screwed this up in a major fashion. I do believe, by the way, speaking of things that you haven't asked me, but I know you're about to, I do believe that the American public is ready to hear a more robust anti-war message than ever before. And I think it's for the following reason. Americans are no longer able to point to an example of a military intervention from the United States, from our Defense Department, and say, notwithstanding the fact that that cost us, lives, thousands of lives, hundreds of thousands of foreign nationals' lives in the case of Afghanistan and Iraq, right? Notwithstanding the fact that it cost us billions of dollars, or in those two cases, trillions of dollars, it was still a good idea. it was in our national interest. There just aren't examples that people would point to and say that. And I think it's time that we recognize that although the Defense Department is good at these sorts of tactics, on a strategic level, we stink. We're good at moving people, moving things. We're good at killing people, blowing things up. We're good at opening and maintaining sea lanes. We're good at taking land and holding it. We're good at toppling governments, if you don't mind the secrets eventually coming out. But we are not good at using military interventionism to achieve what Americans would agree are long-term national interests. We just aren't good at that.
I want cheap healthcare for everyone and cheap housing for everyone. Why should I support the ideas of libertarianism?
Because I'm going to let you pay for as many people's hospital stays as you want, and you can put a sign out in front of your place saying you want everyone to live with you. Look, a lot of the reasons that we have such costly systems, particularly in healthcare, are because of bad public policy, right? We live in an environment where insurance has taken over the healthcare markets. And of course, that was driven by the corporate income tax code, which is a really weird thing. We need to get out from under this notion that everything has to be covered by insurance. And for that, we need to change the tax code. And then we need to get out from under this idea that everything needs to be controlled by the government. And we need to allow markets to work as they should. We need greater transparency. When you have a market with more than one price for the same service, depending on who it is that's paying for it and who it is that is getting the service, you've got a problem. You've got a problem per se. That is, classical sophomore level economic problem that is indicative of the provider having far too much power in a market. And it's because things are controlled too much by insurance and not enough by the customer, who should have full transparency and be able to order services based on price.
Final question. Libertarianism is when everyone does everything by themselves as an atomistic individual with no assistance from the outside. True or false?
It's not even close. I can't even give you false. It's so wrong. Look, libertarianism is not when we all work together. It's a matter of cooperation. It's just a matter of not having the state get in the way. And so in that sense, I think that libertarianism is really a way forward in terms of economic development. Keith, one of the things that drives me craziest is the idea. I believe the following to be one of the most pernicious ideas in all of human history. The idea that the way you get ahead in the world is by taking something from someone else, that our economy is, in essence, a zero-sum game. The truth is that there is such a thing as economic growth. It comes from cooperation, and that cooperation has to take place in an environment of freedom to work efficiently. So libertarians are the ones that are really pro-economic growth based on pro-cooperation, based on keeping the government out of your business.
Check out MikeTermott.com. Links will be in the description below. Mr. Termott, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Keith, thank you. It's a great joy to be with you. I hope we can do it again sometime.